Hello everyone, it's Scott, and I'm back with today's Bloomburrow previews. But before we dive into the interesting cards from the day, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Bloomburrow spoiler season. So let's dive into today. Our first card of the day is Ven the Relentless for 2, a blue and a black mana. You can legendary creature that's a rat rogue, is a 3/4, and has ward 2. And if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. So very powerful ability there on Vran, where you're going to exile your opponent's creatures rather than going to the graveyard. So any graveyard shenanigans that your opponent might be trying to do will be countered by that ability. Just exile everything. And then he also has, at the beginning of each end step, create X/1/1 black rat creature tokens with this creature gets +1/+1 for each other rat you control, where X is the number of creatures your opponent controlled that were exiled this turn. So basically, for every time an opponent's creature dies, you're going to be getting, as a reward for that, as long as Vren's on the field, you're going to get a 1/1 creature that basically has a pseudo prowess type ability where it gets bigger and bigger for each rat that you control. So this is definitely a card that's meant to go in a rat specific deck, but I don't even think you need that. I think any Dimir deck that you would be playing could play this card, and you'd simply benefit from the advantage of creating rats turn after turn after turn, and they grow and grow as the game goes on. So I think this is definitely a card that we're going to see played in Standard. Next, we've got a couple of red cards that I'm excited about, and it seems like so far that Bloomburrow is very strong in red cards because we are losing some important things in the mono red deck, and I think we've got quality replacements for those coming in Bloomburrow. So the first card I want to talk about today is Emberheart Challenger for 1 and a red mana. You get a Mouse Warrior, that's a 2/2 with haste and prowess. And it also has Valiant. So whenever Emberheart Challenger becomes a target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So not only do you get a 2/2 creature with haste and prowess, you get on top of that, if you go ahead and cast a Monstrous Rage on it, you then are going to get to look at the top card of your library and be able to play that card, which I think is a really powerful addition to the mono red deck that currently exists in Standard that's trying to go incredibly fast. So I think this is going to be something that probably is going to replace Bloodthirsty Adversary in the current build of mono red, but I think it may have the ability to be in other decks as well. Maybe the Gruul Slickshot deck might be another place for it as well. So we'll be seeing, I think, Emberheart Challenger as a key card in a couple of decks in Standard. Next, we've got Hired Claw for a red mana. You get a Lizard Mercenary, that's a 1/2, and whenever you attack with one or more lizards, Hired Claws deals 1 damage to target opponent. So you don't even have to attack with Hired Claws, you just need to attack with a lizard. So I think there's Standard playability here if there is some kind of obviously lizard deck that forms, which I don't think we'll have enough cards for, but in any kind of deck where there would be other lizards potentially there, I think that would work with this card. But what it also has is the ability to grow itself, and I think that's probably where we're going to see it shine the most. So for 1 and a red mana, you can put a +1/+1 counter on Hired Claws. You can activate this ability only if an opponent has lost life this turn and only once per turn. So you can activate this after you attack, you deal 1 damage to your opponent, then you can activate it, give it a +1/+1 counter, and now it's a 2/3, and it's going to be harder to trade with in combat. So I think there is a place for this in Standard. I don't know exactly what deck's going to want this, but I think it's an interesting enough card that deck builders will try it in a number of different builds. Next, we've got Dawn's Truce for 1 and a white mana. You get an instant, and it has gift a card. You may promise an opponent a gift as you cast this spell. If you do, they draw a card before its other effects. you and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. If the gift was promised, permanents you control also gain indestructible until end of turn. So I think this is a card that white decks are going to certainly want to consider throwing into their sideboards, because we know there are a lot of wraths in standard right now. So I think because of the number that we have and what's going to be coming down the road, having a way to, in essence, defeat that by playing a card like Dawn's Truce, I think is solid enough in standard to be playable. Now the question is, how many of these would you play? Probably one or two in your sideboard as a kind of a hedge against those kinds of decks. But I think this is going to be one of those cards that either going to be really good or it's going to be really bad, and we'll kind of see what happens with it. Next, we've got the infamous Cruelclaw. For 1, a black and a red mana, you get a legendary creature. That's a Weasel Mercenary. Is a 3/3 with menace. And when the infamous Cruelclaw deals combat damage to a player, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card by discarding a card rather than paying its mana cost. So interesting ability. Basically, Cruelclaw is going to do damage to your opponent, but the benefit of that is you get a card that you're going to be able to play that turn by discarding a card. So I think that makes Cruelclaw potentially playable in standard, particularly if we do end up with some kind of Rakdos deck formed around the Weasels from the set, because we do have other already solid red and black cards that we know would work in that kind of deck. Next, we've got Inkeeper's Talent. For 1 and a green mana, you get an enchantment. That's a class, and you can pay mana to level it up to level 2 and 3. So on level 1, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So a very solid ability on this class. Definitely something that a creature deck may want in standard, and we know there's the likelihood that we're going to see some kind of green-white deck form based on the cards we've seen so far from the set. So this would be a card that kind of fits well into that style of deck. You can pay an additional 1 green mana, and permanents you control with counters on them have ward 1, so a way of protecting your creatures if you've got extra green mana. And then for 3 and a green mana, you can level it up to level 3. If you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. So really powerful ability if you get to the end there and are able to go ahead and basically double the number of counters you're putting on in a given turn. So I think in the late game, you would probably be trying to do that. But I think this, just on that base level of giving a creature a +1/+1 counter at the beginning of combat, I think that's good enough to see play in standard. Next, we've got Mistbreath Elder. For a green mana, you get a Frog Warrior. That's a 2/2. And at the beginning of your upkeep, return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on Mistbreath Elder. Otherwise, you may return Mistbreath Elder to its owner's hand. So weird kind of ability here on this one where you have to return it to your hand or return something else to your hand after you've played it and at the beginning of your upkeep. So I can see this fitting into any kind of deck that has an enter the battlefield triggers that you want to repeat. So in that case, I can see this as a good card in those decks, but in regular standard decks, I just don't see this as seeing much play. All right, so here's some lower rarity cards I think have some standard playability. So the first is Dewdrop Cure. For 2 and a white mana. You get a sorcery with gift a card. Return up to 2 target creature cards, each with mana value 2 or less, from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the gift was promised, instead return up to 3 target creature cards, each with mana value 2 or less, from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I think this is definitely a sideboard card in any white deck. And I could even see, because of the number of spot removal spells we have that end up killing cheap creatures. So even in our Boros Convoke deck as a sideboard option, or even possibly in a Boros deck that is the mouse deck, I think you would want to potentially have this there as something that's going to be able to bring your creatures back from the graveyard and allow them to do some additional damage to your opponent. Next, we've got Life Creed Duo. For 1 and a white mana, you get a Bat Bird. That's a 1/2 with flying, and whenever another creature you control enters, you gain 1 life. So nice life gain ability on this. I think if there is a life gain style deck, this will be a card that fits into that build. Next, we've got Splash Lasher. For 3 and a blue mana, you get a Frog Wizard. That's a 3/3 with Offspring 2, which means you may pay an additional 1 and a blue mana as you cast this spell. If you do, when this creature enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 token copy of it. When this creature enters the battlefield, tap up to 1 target creature and put a stun counter on it. So I think this is a card that may have some sideboard playability. Certainly it's a good limited card where you pay 4 mana, you tap down the creature that your opponent has that's the most damaging or painful for you to play against, say a Sheoldred, and then if you can pay that additional 2 mana, then you can do it to 2 creatures. And I think that's enough to make this, certainly in limited, a good card to play, and potentially somewhat of a sideboard option in standard. Next, we have Downwind Ambusher. For 3 and a black mana, you get a 4/2 Skunk Assassin with Flash, and when Downwind Ambusher enters the battlefield, choose 1 target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn, or destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. So that's where I think this is going to see some play is in limited, and there's maybe some fringe standard playability because of the ability to, in essence, ambush a card where your opponent, in combat attacks, you do damage to a couple of his creatures, and then you can play this and kill one of them, and then you have a 4/2 left on the battlefield. Next, we've got Longstock Brawl. For a green mana, you get a sorcery with gift. In this case, gift a tapped fish. If you promise an opponent a gift as you cast the spell, if you do, they create a tap 1/1 blue fish creature token before its other effects. And its other effect is choose target creature you control and target creature you do not control. Put a +1/+1 counter on the creature you control if the gift was promised. Then those creatures fight each other. So a nice fight spell here. And the nice thing about the gift portion of this is that creature is tapped, so it can't be a blocker that turn. So maybe you can take out a creature on your opponent's side, buff your team a little bit, and then go ahead and attack and hopefully attack for lethal. Next, we've got Burrowguard Mentor. For a green and a white mana, you get a Rabbit Soldier with Trample. And Burrowguard Mentor's power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control. So nice rabbit here that we've got, because we've already got a card that does basically the same thing for 2 mana in white, and that card is seeing play. So I think those 2 cards together, along with some of the other rabbits we've seen so far, kind of make up the core of a rabbit deck that we'll see if it's powerful enough to have a place in standard. All right, our last card of the day is Barkform Harvester. For 3 mana. You get an artifact creature. That's a shapeshifter. It's a 2/4 and is a changeling. That means it's every creature type. It has reach, and for 2, you can put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. Now, this is a common, so I don't think it's probably going to see any significant play in standard, but I do like the ability to take cards out of my graveyard and put them on the bottom of my deck, particularly if I have a deck that I'm going to be shuffling regularly. And if that is the case, then I can, in essence, play something like a Go for the Throat, kill a creature with it, and then pay 2 mana, put it at the bottom of my library, and then next time I shuffle, well, I can maybe shuffle it towards the top of my library where it becomes more effective for me to be able to play it again. And we know cards like this in the past where we're able to shuffle cards back into our library have seen play, so we might see Barkform Harvester for that reason. All right, those are today's Bloomburrow spoilers. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Bloomburrow spoiler season. And let me know what you thought of the cards for today. Thanks. I will see you next time.